1982. As Harvey shows, neoliberals were more Leninist than the Leninists, using think tanks as the intellectual vanguard to create the ideological climate in which capitalist realism could flourish. The immobilization model, which amounts to a demand to retain the Fordist, disciplinary regime, could not work in Britain or the other countries in which neoliberalism has already taken a hold. Fordism has definitively collapsed in Britain, and with it the sites around which the old politics were organized. At the end of the control essay, Deleuze wonders what new forms an anti-control politics might take. One of the most important questions will concern the ineptitude of the unions, tied to the whole of their history of struggle against the disciplines or within the spaces of enclosure. Will they be able to adapt themselves, or will they give way to new forms of resistance against the societies of control? Can we already grasp the rough outlines of the coming forms, capable of threatening the joys of marketing? Many young people strangely boast of being motivated. They request apprenticeships and permanent training. It's up to them to discover what they're being made to serve, just as their elders discovered, not without difficulty, the telos of the disciplines. What must be discovered is a way out of the motivation-demotivation binary, so that disidentification from the control program registers as something other than dejected apathy. One strategy would be to shift the political terrain, to move away from the union's traditional focus on pay and onto forms of discontent specific to post-Fordism. Before we analyze that further, we must consider in more depth what post-Fordism actually is. October 6, 1979. Don't let yourself get attached to anything. A guy told me one time, says organized crime boss Neil McCauley in Michael Mann's 1995 film Heat, don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. One of the easiest ways to grasp the differences between Fordism and post-Fordism is to compare Mann's film with the gangster movies made by Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese between 1971 and 1990. In Heat, the scores are undertaken not by families with links to the old country, but by rootless crews, in an LA of polished chrome and interchangeable designer kitchens, of featureless freeways and late-night diners. All the local color, the cuisine aromas, the cultural idiolects which the likes of The Godfather and Goodfellas depended upon have been painted over and refitted. Heat's Los Angeles is a world without landmarks, a branded sprawl, where markable territory has been replaced by endlessly repeating vistas of replicating franchises. The ghosts of old Europe that stalked Scorsese and Coppola's streets have been exorcised, buried with the ancient beefs, bad blood and burning vendettas somewhere beneath the multinational coffee shops. You can learn a great deal about the world of Heat from considering the name, Neil McCauley. It is an anonymous name, a fake passport name, a name that is bereft of history, even as, ironically, it echoes the name of British historian, Lord Macaulay. Compare Corleone, and remember that The Godfather was named after a village. Macaulay is perhaps the part that De Niro played that is closest to the actor's own personality, a scream, a cipher, depthless, icily professional, stripped down to pure preparation, research, method. I do what I do best. Macaulay is no mafia boss, no puffed-up chief perched atop a Baroque hierarchy governed by codes as solemn and mysterious as those of the Catholic Church and written in the blood of 1,000 feuds. His crew are professionals, hands-on entrepreneur speculators, crime technicians, whose credo is the exact opposite of Cosa Nostra family loyalty. Family ties are unsustainable in these conditions, as Macaulay tells the Pacino character, the driven detective, Vincent Hanna. Now, if you're on me and you gotta move when I move, how do you expect to keep a marriage? Hanna is Macaulay's shadow, forced to assume his insubstantiality, his perpetual mobility. Like any group of shareholders, Macaulay's crew is held together by the prospect of future revenue. Any other bonds are optional extras, almost certainly dangerous. Their arrangement is temporary, pragmatic and lateral. They know that they are interchangeable machine parts, that there are no guarantees, that nothing lasts. Compared to this, the Goodfellas seem like sedentary sentimentalists, rooted in dying communities, doomed territories. The ethos espoused by Macaulay is the one which Richard Sennett examines in The Corrosion of Character, the personal consequences of work in the New Capitalism, a landmark study of the effective changes that the post-Fordist reorganization of work has brought about.
Are you ready?
The slogan which sums up the new conditions is "No long term." Where formerly workers could acquire a single set of skills and expect to progress upwards through a rigid organizational hierarchy, now they are required to periodically re-skill as they move from institution to institution, from role to role. As the organization of work is decentralized, with lateral networks replacing pyramidal hierarchies, a premium is put on flexibility. Echoing Macaulay's mockery of Hannah in Heat, how do you expect to keep a marriage? Sennett emphasizes the intolerable stresses that these conditions of permanent instability put on family life. The values that family life depends upon, obligation, trustworthiness, commitment, are precisely those which are held to be obsolete in the new capitalism. Yet, with the public sphere under attack and the safety nets that a nanny state used to provide being dismantled, the family becomes an increasingly important place of respite from the pressures of a world in which instability is a constant. The situation of the family in post-Fordist capitalism is contradictory, in precisely the way that traditional Marxism expected. Capitalism requires the family, as an essential means of reproducing and caring for labor power, as a salve for the psychic wounds inflicted by anarchic social economic conditions, even as it undermines it, denying parents time with children, putting intolerable stress on couples as they become the exclusive source of effective consolation for each other. According to Marxist economist Christian Marazzi, the switch from Fordism to post-Fordism can be given a very specific date, October 6, 1979. It was on that date that the Federal Reserve increased interest rates by 20 points, preparing the way for the supply-side economics that would constitute the economic reality in which we are now enmeshed. The rise in interest rates not only contained inflation, it made possible a new organization of the means of production and distribution. The rigidity of the Fordist production line gave way to a new flexibility, a word that will send chills of recognition down the spine of every worker today. This flexibility was defined by a deregulation of capital and labor, with the workforce being casualized, with an increasing number of workers employed on a temporary basis, and outsourced. Like Sennett, Marazzi recognizes that the new conditions both required and emerged from an increased cybernetization of the working environment. The Fordist factory was crudely divided into blue and white collar work, with the different types of labor physically delimited by the structure of the building itself. Laboring in noisy environments, watched over by managers and supervisors, workers had access to language only in their breaks, in the toilet, at the end of the working day, or when they were engaged in sabotage because communication interrupted production. But in post-Fordism, when the assembly line becomes a flux of information, people work by communicating. As Norbert Wiener taught, communication and control entail one another. Work and life become inseparable. Capital follows you when you dream. Time ceases to be linear, becomes chaotic, broken down into punctiform divisions. As production and distribution are restructured, so are nervous systems. To function effectively as a component of just-in-time production, you must develop a capacity to respond to unforeseen events. You must learn to live in conditions of total instability, or precarity, as the ugly neologism has it. Periods of work alternate with periods of unemployment. Typically, you find yourself employed in a series of short-term jobs, unable to plan for the future. Both Marazzi and Sennett point out that the disintegration of stable working patterns was in part driven by the desires of workers. It was they who, quite rightly, did not wish to work in the same factory for 40 years. In many ways, the left has never recovered from being wrong-footed by capital's mobilization and metabolization of the desire for emancipation from Fordist routine. Especially in the UK, the traditional representatives of the working class, union and labour leaders, found Fordism rather too congenial. Its stability of antagonism gave them a guaranteed role. But this meant that it was easy for the advocates of post-Fordist capital to present themselves as the opponents of the status quo, bravely resisting an inertial organized labor pointlessly invested in fruitless ideological antagonism which served the ends of union leaders and politicians, but did little to advance the hopes of the class they purportedly represented. Antagonism is not now located externally, in the face-off between class blocks, but internally, in the psychology of the worker, who, as a worker, is interested in old-style class conflict, but, as someone with a pension fund, is also interested in maximizing the yield from his or her investments. There is no longer an identifiable external enemy. The consequence, as Marazi argues, that post-Fordist workers are like the Old Testament Jews after they left the house of slavery, liberated from a bondage to which they have no wish to return but also abandoned, stranded in the desert, confused about the way forward. The psychological conflict raging within individuals cannot but have casualties. Marazi is researching the link between the increase in bipolar disorder and post-Fordism and, if, as Deleuze and Guattari argue, schizophrenia is the condition that marks the outer edges of capitalism, then bipolar disorder is the mental illness proper to the interior of capitalism. With its ceaseless boom and bust cycles, capitalism is itself fundamentally and irreducibly bipolar, periodically lurching between hyped-up mania, the irrational exuberance of bubble thinking, and depressive come down. The term economic depression is no accident, of course. To a degree unprecedented in any other social system, capitalism both feeds on and reproduces the moods of populations.
Are you ready?
Without delirium and confidence, capital could not function. It seems that with post-Fordism, the invisible plague of psychiatric and affective disorders that has spread, silently and stealthily, since around 1750, i.e. the very onset of industrial capitalism, has reached a new level of acuteness. Here, Oliver James's work is important. In The Selfish Capitalist, James points to significant rises in the rates of mental distress over the last 25 years.
Are you ready?
By most criteria, James reports, rates of distress almost doubled between people born in 1946, aged 36 in 1982, and 1970, aged 30 in 2000. For example, 16% of 36-year-old women in 1982 reported having trouble with nerves, feeling low, depressed or sad, whereas 29% of 30-year-olds reported this in 2000. For men, it was 8% in 1982, 13% in 2000. Another British study James cites compared levels of psychiatric morbidity, which includes neurotic symptoms, phobias and depression, in samples of people in 1977 and 1985. Whereas 22% of the 1977 sample reported psychiatric morbidity, this had risen to almost a third of the population, 31% by 1986. Since these rates are much higher in countries that have implemented what James calls selfish capitalism than in other capitalist nations, James hypothesizes that it is selfish, i.e. neoliberalized, capitalist policies and culture that are to blame. Specifically, James points to the way in which selfish capitalism stokes up both aspirations and the expectations that they can be fulfilled. In the entrepreneurial fantasy society, the delusion is fostered that anyone can be Alan Sugar or Bill Gates, never mind that the actual likelihood of this occurring has diminished since the 1970s. A person born in 1958 was more likely than one born in 1970 to achieve upward mobility through education, for example. The selfish capitalist toxins that are most poisonous to well-being are the systematic encouragement of the ideas that material affluence is the key to fulfillment, that only the affluent are winners and that access to the top is open to anyone willing to work hard enough, regardless of their familial, ethnic or social background. If you do not succeed, there is only one person to blame. James's conjectures about aspirations, expectations and fantasy fit with my own observations of what I have called hedonic depression in British youth. It is telling, in this context of rising rates of mental illness, that New Labour committed itself, early in its third term in government, to removing people from incapacity benefit, implying that many, if not most, claimants are malingerers. In contrast with this assumption, it doesn't seem unreasonable to infer that most of the people claiming incapacity benefit, and there are well in excess of 2 million of them, are casualties of capital. A significant proportion of claimants, for instance, are people psychologically damaged as a consequence of the capitalist realist insistence that industries such as mining are no longer economically viable. Even considered in brute economic terms, though, the arguments about viability seem rather less than convincing, especially once you factor in the cost to taxpayers of incapacity and other benefits. Many have simply buckled under the terrifyingly unstable conditions of post-Fordism. The current ruling ontology denies any possibility of a social causation of mental illness. The chemico-biologization of mental illness is of course strictly commensurate with its depoliticization. Considering mental illness an individual chemico-biological problem has enormous benefits for capitalism. First, it reinforces capital's drive towards atomistic individualization. You are sick because of your brain chemistry. Second, it provides an enormously lucrative market in which multinational pharmaceutical companies can peddle their pharmaceuticals. We can cure you with our SSRIs. It goes without saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated, but this says nothing about their causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. It does not seem fanciful to see parallels between the rising incidence of mental distress and new patterns of assessing workers' performance. We will now take a closer look at this new bureaucracy. All that is solid melts into PR, market Stalinism and bureaucratic anti-production. Mike Judge's unjustly undercelebrated film Office Space, 1999, is as acute an account of the 90s-2000s workplace as Schrader's Blue Collar, 1978, was of 70s labor relations. Instead of the confrontation between trade union officials and management in a factory, Judge's film shows a corporation sclerotized by administrative anti-production. Workers receive multiple memos from different managers saying the exact same thing. Naturally, the memo concerns a bureaucratic practice. It aims to induce compliance with a new procedure of putting cover sheets on reports. In keeping with the being smart ethos, the management style in Office Space is a mixture of shirt-sleeves informality and quiet authoritarianism. Judge shows this same managerialism presides in the corporate coffee chain, where the office workers go to relax. Here, staff are required to decorate their uniforms with 7 pieces of flair, i.e. badges or other personal tokens, to express their individuality and creativity, a handy illustration of the way in which creativity and self-expression have become intrinsic to labor in control societies, which, as Paulo Vernot, Jan Mulier-Boutang and others have pointed out, now makes effective, as well as productive demands, on workers. Furthermore, the attempt to crudely quantify these effective contributions also tells us a great deal about the new arrangements. The Flair example also points to another phenomenon, hidden expectations behind official standards. Joanna, a waitress at the coffee chain, wears exactly 7 pieces of flair, but it is made clear to her that even though 7 is officially enough, it is actually inadequate. The manager asks if she wants to look the sort of person who only does the bare minimum. You know what, Stan, if you want me to wear 37 pieces of flair, Joanna complains, why don't you just make the minimum 37 pieces of flair? Well, the manager replies, I thought I remembered you saying that you wanted to express yourself. Enough is no longer enough.
Are you ready?
This syndrome will be familiar to many workers who may find that a satisfactory grading in a performance evaluation is no longer satisfactory. In many educational institutions, for instance, if after a classroom observation a teacher is graded as satisfactory, they will be required to undertake training prior to a reassessment. Initially, it might appear to be a mystery that bureaucratic measures should have intensified under neoliberal governments that have presented themselves as anti-bureaucratic and anti-Stalinist. Yet new kinds of bureaucracy, aims and objectives, outcomes, mission statements have proliferated even as neoliberal rhetoric about the end of top-down, centralized control has gained preeminence. It might seem that bureaucracy is a kind of return of the repressed, ironically re-emerging at the heart of a system which has professed to destroy it. But the resurgence of bureaucracy in neoliberalism is more than an atavism or an anomaly. As I have already indicated, there is no contradiction between being smart and the increase of administration and regulation. They are two sides of labor and control societies. Richard Sennett has argued that the flattening of pyramidal hierarchies has actually led to more surveillance of workers. One of the claims made for the new organization of work is that it decentralizes power, that is, gives people in the lower ranks of organization more control over their own activities, Sennett writes. Certainly this claim is false in terms of the techniques employed for taking apart the old bureaucratic behemoths. The new information systems provide a comprehensive picture of the organization to top managers in ways which give individuals anywhere in the network little room to hide. But it isn't only that information technology has granted managers more access to data, it is that the data itself has proliferated. Much of this information is provided by workers themselves. Massimo De Angelis and David Harvey describe some of the bureaucratic measures with which a lecturer must comply when putting together a module for an undergraduate degree in British universities. For each module, De Angelis and Harvey write that module leader (ML), i.e., lecturer, must complete various paperwork, in particular a module specification, at the module start, which lists the module's aims and objectives, ELOs, modes and methods of assessment, amongst other information, and a module review document at the end of the module, in which the ML reports their own assessment of the module's strengths and weaknesses and their suggested changes for the following year, a summary of student feedback, and average marks and their dispersion. This is only the beginning, however. For the degree program as a whole, academics must prepare a program specification, as well as producing annual program reports, which record student performance according to progression rates, withdrawal rates, location and spread of marks. All students' marks have to be graded against a matrix. This auto-surveillance is complemented by assessments carried out by external authorities. The marking of student assignments is monitored by external examiners, who are supposed to maintain consistency of standards across the university sector. Lecturers have to be observed by their peers, while departments are subject to periodic 3- or 4-day inspections by the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education, QAA. If they are research active, lecturers must submit their best 4 publications every 4 or 5 years to be graded by panel as part of the research assessment exercise, replaced in 2008 by the equally controversial Research Excellence Framework. De Angelis and Harvey are clear that these are only very sketchy accounts of only some of the bureaucratic tasks that academics have to perform, all of which have funding implications for institutions. This battery of bureaucratic procedures is by no means confined to universities, nor to education. Other public services, such as the National Health Service and the police force, find themselves enmeshed in similar bureaucratic metastasis. This is in part a consequence of the inherent resistance of certain processes and services to marketization. The supposed marketization of education, for instance, rests on a confused and underdeveloped analogy. Are students the consumers of the service or its product? The idealized market was supposed to deliver friction-free exchanges, in which the desires of consumers would be met directly, without the need for intervention or mediation by regulatory agencies. Yet the drive to assess the performance of workers and to measure forms of labor which, by their nature, are resistant to quantification, has inevitably required additional layers of management and bureaucracy. What we have is not a direct comparison of workers' performance or output, but a comparison between the audited representation of that performance and output. Inevitably, a short-circuiting occurs, and work becomes geared towards the generation and massaging of representations rather than to the official goals of the work itself. Indeed, an anthropological study of local government in Britain argues that more effort goes into ensuring that a local authority's services are represented correctly than goes into actually improving those services. This reversal of priorities is one of the hallmarks of a system which can be characterized without hyperbole as market Stalinism. What late capitalism repeats from Stalinism is just this valuing of symbols of achievement over actual achievement. As Marshall Berman explained, describing Stalin's White Sea Canal project of 1931–33, Stalin seems to have been so intent on creating a highly visible symbol of development that he pushed and squeezed the project in ways that only retarded the development of the project. Thus the workers and the engineers were never allowed the time, money or equipment necessary to build a canal that would be deep enough and safe enough to carry 20th-century cargoes. Consequently, the canal has never played any significant role in Soviet commerce or industry. All the canal could support, apparently, were tourist steamers, which in the 1930s were abundantly stocked with Soviet and foreign writers who obligingly proclaimed the glories of the work. The canal was a triumph of publicity, but if half the care that went into the public relations campaign had been devoted to the work itself, there would have been far fewer victims and far more real developments, and the project would have been a genuine tragedy, rather than a brutal farce in which real people were killed by pseudovits. In a strange compulsion to repeat, the ostensibly anti-Stalinist neoliberal New Labour government has shown the same tendency to implement initiatives in which real-world effects matter only insofar as they register at the level of PR appearance. The notorious targets, which the New Labour government was so enthusiastic in imposing, are a case in point. In a process that repeats itself with iron predictability everywhere that they are installed, targets quickly cease to be a way of measuring performance and become ends in themselves. Anxiety about falling standards in school examinations is now a regular feature of the summertime in Britain. Yet if students are less skilled and knowledgeable than their predecessors, this is due not to a decline in the quality of examinations per se, but to the fact that all of the teaching is geared towards passing the exams. Narrowly focused exam drill replaces a wider engagement with subjects. Similarly, hospitals perform many routine procedures instead of a few serious, urgent operations, because this allows them to hit the targets they are assessed on: operating rates, success rates and reduction in waiting time, more effectively. It would be a mistake to regard this market Stalinism as some deviation from the true spirit of capitalism. On the contrary, it would be better to say that an essential dimension of Stalinism was inhibited by its association with a social project like socialism that can only emerge in a late capitalist culture in which images acquire an autonomous force. The way value is generated on the stock exchange depends of course less on what a company really does, and more on perceptions of, and beliefs about, its future performance. In capitalism, that is to say, all that is solid melts into PR, and late capitalism is defined at least as much by this ubiquitous tendency towards PR production as it is by the imposition of market mechanisms. Here, Zizek's elaboration of Lacan's concept of the big other is crucial. The big other is the collective fiction, the symbolic structure, presupposed by any social field. The big other can never be encountered in itself, instead, we only ever confront its stand-ins. These representatives are by no means always leaders. In the example of the White Sea Canal above, for instance, it wasn't Stalin himself who was the representative of the big other so much as the Soviet and foreign writers who had to be persuaded of the glories of the project. One important dimension of the big other is that it does not know everything. It is this constitutive ignorance of the big other that allows public relations to function. Indeed, the big other could be defined as the consumer of PR and propaganda, the virtual figure which is required to believe even when no individual can. To use one of Zizek's examples, who was it, for instance, who didn't know that really existing socialism res was shabby and corrupt? Not any of the people, who were all too aware of its shortcomings, nor any of the government administrators, who couldn't but know. No, it was the big other who was the one deemed not to know, who wasn't allowed to know, the quotidian reality of res. Yet the distinction between what the big other knows, i.e. what is officially accepted, and what is widely known and experienced by actual individuals, is very far from being merely emptily formal, but is the discrepancy between the two that allows ordinary, social reality to function. When the illusion that the big other did not know can no longer be maintained, the incorporeal fabric holding the social system together disintegrates. This is why Khrushchev's speech in 1965, in which he admitted the failings of the Soviet state, was so momentous. It is not as if anyone in the party was unaware of the atrocities and corruption carried out in its name, but Khrushchev's announcement made it impossible to believe any more that the big other was ignorant of them. So much for really existing socialism, but what of really existing capitalism? One way to understand the realism of capitalist realism is in terms of the claim to have given up belief in the big other. Postmodernism can be construed as the name for the complex of crises that the decline in the belief in the big other has triggered, as Lyotard's famous formulation of the postmodern condition incredulity towards metanarrative suggests. Jameson, of course, would argue that the incredulity towards metanarratives is one expression of the cultural logic of late capitalism, a consequence of the switch into the post-Fordist mode of capital accumulation. Nick Land gives one of the most euphoric accounts of the postmodern meltdown of culture into the economy. In Land's work, a cybernetically upgraded invisible hand is progressively eliminating centralized state power. Land's 90s text synthesized cybernetics, complexity theory, cyberpunk fiction and neoliberalism to construct a vision of capital planetary artificial intelligence, a vast supple endlessly fissile system which renders human will obsolete. In his manifesto for nonlinear, decentered capital, Meltdown, Land invokes a massively distributed matrix network tendency oriented to disabling ROM command control programs sustaining all macro and micro governmental entities, globally concentrating themselves as the human security system. This is capitalism as a shattering reel, in which viral, digital, signals circulate on self-sustaining networks which bypass the symbolic, and therefore do not require the big other as guarantor. It is Deleuze and Guattari's capital as unnameable thing, but without the forces of reterritorialization and anti-production which they argued were constitutive of capitalism. One of the problems of Land's position is also what is most interesting about it, precisely that it posits a pure capitalism, a capitalism which is only inhibited and blocked by extrinsic, rather than internal, elements. According to Land's logic, these elements are atavisms that will eventually be consumed and metabolized by capital. Yet capitalism cannot be purified. In this way, strip away the forces of anti-production and capitalism disappears with them. Similarly, there is no progressive tendency towards an unsheathing of capitalism, no gradual unmasking of capital as it really is, rapacious, indifferent, inhuman. On the contrary, the essential role of the incorporeal transformation, effectuated by PR, branding and advertising in capitalism suggests that, in order to operate effectively, capitalism's rapacity depends upon various forms of sheathing. Really existing capitalism is marked by the same division which characterized really existing socialism, between, on the one hand, an official culture in which capitalist enterprises are presented as socially responsible and caring, and, on the other, a widespread awareness that companies are actually corrupt, ruthless, etc. In other words, capitalist postmodernity is not quite as incredulous as it would appear to be, as the jeweler Gerald Ratner famously found to his cost. Ratner precisely tried to circumvent the symbolic and tell it how it is, describing the inexpensive jewelry his shop sold as crap in an after-dinner speech. But the consequence of Ratner making this judgment official were immediate, and serious £500 million was wiped off the value of the company and he lost his job. Customers might previously have known that the jewelry Ratner sold was poor quality, but the big other didn't know. As soon as it did, Ratner's collapsed. Vernacular postmodernism has dealt with the crisis of symbolic efficiency in a far less intense way than Nick Land, through metafictional anxieties about the function of the author, and in television programs or films which expose the mechanisms of their own productions and reflexively incorporate discussions of their own status as commodities. But postmodernism's supposed gestures of demystification do not evince sophistication so much as a certain naivety, a conviction that there were others, in the past, who really believed in the symbolic. In fact, of course, symbolic efficiency was achieved precisely by maintaining a clear distinction between a material empirical causality, and another incorporeal causality proper to the symbolic. Zizek gives the example of a judge. I know very well that things are the way I see them, that this person is a corrupted weakling, but I nonetheless treat him respectfully, since he wears the insignia of a judge, so that when he speaks, it is the law itself which speaks through him. However, postmodernism's cynical reduction to reality falls short. When a judge speaks, there is in a way more truth in his words, the words of the institution of law, than in the